Over 6 billion people on Earth make up the human family. In this busy world, we typically only concern ourselves with the present. But looking back at where our families come from can be one of the most compelling activities we engage in. In this pursuit, many have utilized genealogical research to be able to reach back into the past, to figure out who they are and where they came from.
I've always had an interest in history and how I fit into history, how my family fits into history. And I find it fascinating, I guess, just to know the things that my ancestors participated in.
What interests me is connecting with people who are so intimately connected to who I am.
I've always been interested in family history ever since I was a young boy. I can remember about being 7, 8 years old and asking my great-grandmother to tell me stories about her parents.
Professionally, I've done it for 18 years, 17, 18 years, and it's fun. I like working with the different people and their fascination with their families, which I think is really the main reason why we need to be doing genealogy, family history.
Doing genealogical research always begins easily because it starts with you. But as you travel back through generations, answers are harder to come by, and sometimes the materials we use in our research give out, simply reaching a point and going no further. Records, certificates, and other documents won't be found, with no information or clues to the next step. It is like going on a road trip, and as you get further and further from your hometown, you notice that more and more of the map is missing. You know that those areas do exist, you just don't know where the road is or what the towns are called.
It doesn't matter whether you're a beginner genealogist or whether you've been working at this for generations. You are going to run into roadblocks. Or brick walls, sometimes we call them, where you can't go any further. There are no records existing that you can find that tell you who is that person in the next generation.
Darrell Pauley from northern Kentucky is an avid genealogist. For him, the records became scarce the further back he traced his family line.
I think what got me interested in genealogy was my mother, when I was a very small boy, told me a story about her grandfather. I'm the late-born child of 2 late-born children, so I didn't have any grandparents alive when I was born. And my parents passed when I was in my 20s. And tracing back, of course, Kentucky was part of Virginia at one time. And tracing back through, there was a group of people with Pauley surname that wound up in what became Pittsylvania County, Virginia in the 1750s. And it just looked like an obvious potential link that those people could be the ones that showed up in Kentucky, and the names matched. But I couldn't find records. You know, at that time, Western Virginia was absolutely out in the wilderness. It's one of those things that on the frontier, and it was very hard to find any kind of records to substantiate that these were the same people.
Dick Hacken, a librarian at Brigham Young University, has a brick wall of his own in his family history. He's trying to fill a blank in his pedigree chart where his great-grandfather should be.
So my grandfather apparently was an illegitimate child. And so my great-grandmother had him in Switzerland And then some years later, I think when he was relatively young, probably a child, then they moved to the United States.
As with most children born out of wedlock, records are not overly abundant, and without surviving relatives with knowledge or some kind of documentation, a gap in one's history like this might never be resolved. But beyond the pedigree chart, there's the sense of belonging that comes from understanding the geographic and cultural origins of your progenitors. Garry Bryant, a retired photojournalist in Farmington, Utah, is passionate about his cultural ties to the past and wants to know for sure where his family name originated.
As far as my family tradition went, the tradition is that the family came from Ireland to Canada in about 1830.
Garry Bryant shares the last name of his ancestor, William Bryant, who ran away from his home in Canada down into Colorado during the 1850s. The dilemma is that Bryant is an English name that doesn't fit the Irish tradition that Garry felt he belonged to. His desire to identify with his heritage was a driving force behind his search.
In 1993, I suffered a brainstem stroke. And while lying in the ICU, and all I could do is think, I would recite, go through my pedigree in my mind. And I think that's one of the things that kept my mind active, is going through that reciting over and over, generation upon generation. And in that darkness and in that quiet, it was like I heard a voice in my mind that said, "You're a son, you're a descendant of Brian Boru, the High King of Ireland. You're a warrior by blood, thus fight. Fight through the obstacles that are going to be before you." And the remembrance of that got me going. I wanted to know, am I really a bloodline O'Brien, or am I an English Bryant? Because English Bryants and Bryans went to Ireland, settled in Ireland. So, I mean, which am I? But as far as documenting, am I an O'Brien or am I a Bryant, there was no piece of paper that said so.
Discovering and solving these genealogical mysteries can seem like a puzzle that has run out of pieces. But new scientific processes have emerged to allow a different way to overcome genealogical roadblocks. The scientific field of DNA is making substantial strides that overlap with genealogical research in extraordinary ways. Up until now, most people know DNA has been used as a forensic or law enforcement tool. That same technology is now used to help with family history research in a field known as genetic genealogy. DNA can be used to identify who we are related to today, helping us to determine who we're related to in the past. DNA is present in everyone, so clues to the answers that Dick, Daryl, and Garry are looking for may actually be inside of themselves.
DNA is an amazing molecule. Encoded in the DNA essentially are all of the blueprints for building this physical body. But not only the blueprints, but it also has the instructions on how those blueprints should be used, how they should be brought together.
An extraordinary amount of data is stored in DNA. It resides in every cell of the body and is organized into pairs of chromosomes inside the nucleus of each cell. It has a complex makeup of chemical bases, sugars, and phosphates, and forms a double helix.
Each one of the cells in our body contains a complete copy of our DNA, a complete set of instructions for rebuilding this body. But the other very intriguing thing about the DNA to me, and in connection with genealogical work, is that all of the DNA that I have came from my parents. all of the DNA that my parents have came from my 4 grandparents, and so on and so on. And so what that says is that I am carrying within my DNA bits and pieces of my grandparents, my great-grandparents, my great-great-grandparents, and essentially all of my ancestors.
The potential that genetic genealogy has is to help people find others they're genetically similar to. In doing so, there's the possibility to identify common relations and to build on each other's known genealogical records.
Ultimately, I started looking at DNA to determine, hey, maybe I can prove some connections, prove that I am or am not related to specific branches of the family. So that's what really got me into DNA to start with.
A lot of us have written genealogies that go back 4 or 5, maybe 6 generations. At that point, 6, 8, 10 generations back to maybe about 15 generations or so is a place where DNA becomes very powerful and very useful in finding connections between individuals that don't exist on our written genealogical charts.
Combining current DNA capabilities with traditional genealogical approaches can have substantial results. The Sorensen Molecular Genealogy Foundation in Salt Lake City, Utah, has built an accessible DNA database that helps people connect the world over. The Sorensen Molecular Genealogy Foundation has been building this database for nearly a decade now. It consists of DNA samples from around the world, each of which are attached to genealogical information. As individuals have donated samples, they are required to accompany the sample with as much pedigree information as possible. This way, when people match each other on the database, they are able to see the pedigree information of the people they match. Those that search the database can confirm relation to the family names or discover new names that they may be related to.
The Sorensen Molecular Genealogy Foundation has as a main objective to build a database of correlated genealogical and genetic information to help people trace their ancestry, to find the possible connections that would not be possible to be found using traditional records.
The whole idea behind combining DNA and genealogies together was to help people answer genealogical questions. And so we built the database to do exactly that. And now that's what's happening. People are able to use the database, use their own DNA, and to be able to find connections and links that just weren't possible just a few years ago.
I thought it was also important, like when the Sorensen Foundation began doing this research, they required a pedigree chart. They required a paper. And that kind of verified in my mind that they were not going after things that were not to be verified. And that was an opening for both the genealogist and the DNA researcher to walk hand in hand, to work with one another.
Our goal from the beginning was to ask individuals who were successful in finding good number of generations on their pedigree chart. At the first we asked for at least 4 generations. We soon realized that actually wasn't really the number of generations that was important as much as far back in time you could go, and if you were able or not to find the original countries of birth.
Family researchers are in constant search of genealogical information, and DNA helps family researchers find others who have the data they need. Today, both men and women can have their DNA examined through different scientific procedures.
We have a lot of different types of DNA in each one of our cells, and they have different inheritance patterns. Most of our DNA comes essentially 50% from mom, 50% from dad. But in males, there's a piece of DNA that comes directly from my father. I didn't get it from my mother, or part of it from my mother. It just came straight from my dad, and it's known as the Y chromosome. And only males have a Y chromosome. And so if you look at a Y chromosome and all of the information on it that I inherited directly from my father, it follows essentially my surname back into the past.
Each person has 23 pairs of chromosomes. one of which determines gender with either a pair of X chromosomes for females or an X and a Y chromosome for males. This Y chromosome contains genetic information that is passed from father to son with little or no change. So individuals from a common ancestor have very similar Y chromosome data.
The Y chromosome is one of the chromosomes that we have that makes our DNA. So imagine the Y chromosome being like a long line, a segment that you have of a specific length. And every male carries Y chromosomes. And so every man has the same structure of the Y chromosome and same map of the Y chromosome. And so you take location number 1, for example, on the Y chromosome, then any man would have that location number 1. What changes from a man to another man is the type of information you would have inherited from your ancestor on that location 1.
These locations on the Y chromosome, or markers, have a value assigned to them that, when viewed together as a group of markers, constitute a unique pattern in an individual's DNA. This pattern is nearly identical to paternal ancestors. The key is that these patterns on the Y chromosome slowly change over generations of time, creating differences between people.
Basically, you have a genetic signature made up of a set of values, and then you use the set of values to compare it with other individuals until you find somebody that shares the same set of values you do, and then you are closely related to that individual.
When individuals that share a common ancestor test their DNA, they will show all or most of their Y chromosome markers as matching. When a strong match is made, individuals can compare their genealogical records with the records of the people they match, and potentially add to what they know about their ancestry. A match, or relationship from markers, is exactly what Darryl Pauly hoped to find: a connection, someone that shared the same DNA markers on the Y chromosome. If he did that, the next thing would be to see if that person he matched could trace their line through the names he found in Pittsylvania County, Virginia.
What I was looking for, of course taking it a step at a time, I was looking to prove that yes, the people in Pennsylvania County, Virginia were the people that, or at least were related to the people who wound up in Kentucky.
Garry Bryant's question about his cultural origin might also benefit from finding a match. If he can match someone that can clearly trace their ancestry to Ireland, he would be able to determine that his ancestors did indeed come from Ireland, and help solve the mystery of whether he is an O'Brien or not. Dick Hacken realizes that he could possibly find who his great-grandfather is if he were to test his own DNA and search the SMGF database.
As I've learned more about DNA testing, I've realized that what can be tested from a male is that on the Y side, it's the father's 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 father all the way back. So it's always the paternal side, and that would be indeed my father's father's father.